Hello, everyone. You hear me okay? Good afternoon. I'm Jane Simone. I'm the Associate Director at NIH for the Behavioral and Social Sciences, and I'm the Director of the Office of Behavioral and Social Sciences Research here on campus. Our annual Matilda White Riley event is an opportunity for lively engagement with researchers who, like our event's namesake, have applied clarity and rigor in their research to challenge accepted notions about behavioral and social aspects of public health and to pursue research efforts that really impact policy, practice, and public perception to improve our understanding of what health and health equity can be. It is so exciting to have, especially our early stage investigators, or ESIs, here today, and to honor our distinguished lecturer, Dr. Bernice Pesquisolido from Indiana University, who will also deliver the keynote address entitled The Power of Human Connection to Health and Healthcare. Our ESI honorees were selected out of a group of 80 researchers, so it's a very competitive group this year, who submitted published peer-reviewed papers to our ESI paper competition. Each paper was carefully reviewed by our staff and rated based on the following questions, informed by Dr. Matilda White Riley's scientific legacy. First, how potentially impactful or influential is the paper on the health-related behavioral and social sciences? How well does the paper use sophisticated methodological approaches to address important empirical questions that are derived from or that inform theoretical frameworks? Third, how well does the paper integrate multiple levels of influence and/or the dynamic, longitudinal, and bidirectional effects of social systems on individuals and vice versa? And then finally, how well does the paper integrate approaches from multiple disciplines to address the research question? So congratulations to this year's ESI honorees, Dr. Jeremy Luke, Kristen Perry, Gianna Ray Sandin, Elise Turlin, and Vanessa Volpe. Dr. Lauren Fordyce, a couple of housekeeping notes. Dr. Lauren Fordyce will moderate the ESI presentations, and Dr. Erica Spotts will moderate the distinguished lecturer presentation. As OBSSR staff, they will facilitate the Q&A and convey your questions and comments to the presenters. Today's event is being broadcast through NIH Videocast, and questions from Videocast viewers can be submitted via the feedback form. To submit a question, virtual attendees may select the Send Live Feedback icon on the NIH video page and enter Videocast page and enter your comment or question, which we will receive in real time. During each Q&A, we'll try to alternate between in-person and the virtual questions. Please feel free to send your questions at any time during the presentation. So thank you again for joining the 17th annual Matilda White Riley Behavioral and Social Science Honors event. We hope you enjoy it. And now I turn it over to Dr. Lauren Fordyce.
Thank you, Dr. Simone. So we're going to begin with our ESI portion of our event. So each ESI will deliver a 15-minute presentation, and then all of them will give their presentations. And then after that, we'll have a moderated discussion where we can take questions from those of us in the room and from the Q&A online. So I wanted to remind you of our event guidelines. Please note that participants are required to uphold the professional purposes of this meeting, and please keep all comments relevant to the event topic. As Dr. Simone just mentioned, we have a live feedback button, which those of you who are observing from your homes or your offices or your car, you can send, there's a little button that send live feedback. So you click on that and you can submit your questions. If you have any issues with technical support, you can call the IT service desk. And as a reminder, this event is being recorded and it will be available about 1 month or more on our website. Oops. Well, I can introduce Jeremy with his main slide here. So I'm excited today to introduce our investigators. And it was an extremely competitive year, as Dr. Simone just mentioned, and we selected 5 ESIs, and 4 of them will be presenting today: Dr. Luke, Dr. Perry, Dr. Ray Sandin, and Dr. Tulien. Additionally, Dr. Vanessa Volpe was also selected. She could not present today, but we will be featuring her at some point, so please keep an eye out for her future presentation. I'm going to go ahead and introduce Dr. Luke. He is a clinical psychologist within the Office of the Clinical Director at the National Institute of Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism, so here at the NIH. He is a licensed clinical psychologist with research experience in alcohol use, mental health, health disparities, and statistical methods. In his current role, he provides clinical services to patients with alcohol use disorder and supervises doctoral students in clinical psychology. His recent research focuses on understanding multidimensional quality of life in the context of recovery and the application of third wave behavioral therapies to treat addictive behaviors. His presentation today is inspired by his recent publication, A Person-Centered Approach to Capture Health Disparities and the Multidimensional Impact of COVID-Related Stressors, which was published in American Psychologist. And Dr. Luke, you're welcome to come up and begin your presentation.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's a real honor to be here to share some of my recent work. As introduced by Lauren, my talk today is going to be on a person-centered approach to capture health disparities and multidimensional impact of COVID-related stressors. So I have 15 minutes. I may not be able to go over everything included in the paper, so some of the details I'm going to leave out. But this is the paper published last year in American Psychologist, and here are some of my my co-authors, which I definitely want to acknowledge, because without the team, this would not happen. So during the COVID-19 pandemic, there were a lot of kind of unexpected changes that people have to adjust to. And in the literature, there are different ways that we conceptualize COVID-related stress. One of the ways was to look at some of the changes as a function of like how people, as they experience the COVID pandemic, some of the adjustments that they have to make. So what are some of the changes? I think the pandemic has really influenced people's lives in very diverse ways. So there's not only one way, but people experience in different ways. So from the very early stage where there was shutdowns and, there's a lot of social isolation, there could be a lot of changes to how people approach work. In some places, some of the work would be switched to telework, and then for some people, there would be more work, there would be less work. There could be essential workers who might be particularly affected. And then there's the financial piece. There could be loss of income when people are not able to work in certain areas. Depending on what they do, financial stress, couldn't pay their bills, have to worry about, things like paying for gas or, other things, a lot of financial related things. And then also there could be, the actual COVID infection to the self, to those around you, and then, different ways, for example, the loss of a loved one due to COVID-19. So just to lay out, there are a lot of ways the pandemic could impact people's life. And I think in the literature, some of these changes or some of these impacts has been conceptualized as COVID-related stress. And we know from addiction kind of theory that when there's stress, some people might drink to cope with the stress. So here is a very simple illustration of how that might be the case during the pandemic. Maybe healthcare workers, right? A lot of stress because of the increased workload. And people, it might be the social isolation that was very difficult and it was stressful for people. One of the questions as I approach, this within a larger project at NIAAA, we have a project that really tried to follow up on some of the patients or the participants who came to the NIH to do research, and we're able to kind of follow them during the pandemic, so that we try to look at, like, before the pandemic, we have some historical data on them. So during the pandemic, we want to see how they are doing during the pandemic. And we have some measures from the CDC COVID-19 community survey bank questions. And all of these would map onto what I just mentioned about the COVID-related stress. So the study objective is to figure out, like, what is the best way to kind of model these stressors, and then also to examine health disparities in exposure to COVID-related stressors, and then also to examine the impact on mental health, alcohol-related outcomes, and quality of life. So the data source is from NIAAA COVID-19 pandemic impact on alcohol study. The study design is that this is a longitudinal study that spans 2 years. So we are still actually collecting some data because there was some extension of the recruitment frame. In this analysis, the data collection was done from June 3rd, 2020 to January 6th, 2022. The participants included 463 adults. The mean age was about 45 years of age. It was about half male and female. The sample was diverse in terms of race and ethnicity. Because we're at NIAAA, so we have historic data about whether they had alcohol use disorder, AUD, or not. And so in this sample, we have 42% with a history of alcohol use disorder. We also asked them whether they were being tested for COVID-19. So only 50% of them were tested for COVID-19. And in this sample, there were only 11 people who reported being tested positive. So it's a very small number here. So in terms of the measures, I will show you the COVID-related stress measures in the subsequent slide. In terms of the outcome measures, we have a lot of different kind of areas. So like perceived stress scale, alcohol use disorder, we use the audit to measure it. We have anxiety, depression measured by the G87 and the PHQ-9. We're also interested in craving, alcohol craving. So we have the PEN alcohol craving scale. We have some additional secondary outcomes that we were interested in, including loneliness, drinking to cope, and also very importantly, NIAAA has recently put out a new definition of recovery, which really expand the scope to from not just abstinence only, but also considering quality of life as part of recovery, kind of thinking about the whole person. So we also have this measure on quality of life. It has 4 domains: physical, psychological, social, and environment. Okay, so these are the items taken from the CDC. We sort of took some of them, I think 13 of them were directly from that question bank. And then there were a few that we sort of added, like the essential worker one, and then the last 3 questions, we kind of adapted and integrated it into this list. But essentially, here I color-coded them. So the first couple, 1 through 5, they are related to work. For example, the second one is worked more hours than usual. The third one is worked reduced hours. Number 4 is was not able to work. So most of these are, potentially stressful. There's one exception. Number 1 was reverse coded because it talks about telework, and probably that's in the literature, people also talk about it as increased flexibility actually helps people to, it's less stressful for people. Items 6 and 7 are related to childcare. Number 8 through 14 are related to financial stress. So example would be income or pay has been reduced, or no pay at all, did not have enough money to pay rent, food, or gas, and so on. And then the last three questions are related to whether they have a family member or a close friend or partner being affected by COVID-19 in terms of infection, hospitalization, and death. On the right, you see the percent. So the, different, for example, work more hours was endorsed by 28% of the sample. Income or pay has been reduced 27%. So when I look at the literature and see how people go about measuring the construct of COVID-related stress, I see people trying to just add them up. So 17 items, reverse code one and then add them up. It's an index of stress, right? So that's what I've done with, on the left here, continuous sum score. So you can see that, people endorse different numbers of COVID-related stressors. And, it makes sense. Like you add them up, that's one valid method of doing it. On the right is what I call the categorical grouping, where you sort of look at the endorsement and then you create some sort of arbitrary cutoffs and say, like, if someone endorsed 0 or 1 of these stressors, it would be low stress, and then 2 to 3 would be medium, and then 4 or more would be high. So that's what I've done on the right. And then I also applied the latent class analysis approach, which has the ability to identify hidden groups of people where they might share the same pattern of endorsement for these COVID-related stressors. So we have 4 classes. The first class made up of about half of the sample, which I call minimal COVID-related impact. The second class is work interruptions, about 25% of the sample. And then the third class, family or friends affected by COVID, is about 15%. And then the last class is serious financial stress. You can see that class is about 9%. So some of our key findings is that when we look at these latent classes, we really see health disparities. In terms of race and ethnicity, we see that Black or African Americans were more likely to be in class 3, where they have family or friends affected by COVID-19. When we look at education and income, we see that those with have more years of education and higher income were much less likely to be in class 4, the class with serious financial stress. And then for history of AUD, individuals with history of AUD were more likely to be in the classes with work interruptions and serious financial stress. And then when I look at some of the outcomes, it's a very consistent pattern. If I use the continuous sum score or the categorical variable, it tells me that, more stress, more worse outcomes. However, when we use the latent classes, it's clear that the class with financial stress, the last class with 9%, always had the highest endorsement in terms of perceived stress, in terms of problematic drinking, anxiety, depression, alcohol craving. And going to the next slide, it's also consistent for loneliness, drinking to cope, and all 4 domains of quality of life. So I think in this particular situation, the latent class analysis was quite useful because it helps us figure out what groups of people we have. And it's not just like more stress is worse outcomes, but like there is a group of people who had serious financial stressors and they fared worse across multiple outcomes. I think that the ability to look at this different groups, demographic groups, and also individuals with AUD sort of show that there might be certain groups of people who might be experiencing different set of stressors. So I think it's informative for targeted intervention. In the paper, we talk a lot about holistic intervention and community outreach, which I still believe is very relevant. I have a few thoughts about like the next steps. But some of the things that we have done with this same sample is to look at, additional subgroups of people who might be most vulnerable to stress. So using these same items, for example, in a recent paper, we showed that individuals with a history of suicidality was more vulnerable to the negative impact of stress on mental health outcomes. So I think that's a really useful approach to identify groups of people who might need more help. And then I think the loneliness finding was interesting, especially because of the loneliness epidemic. And so in another recent paper, we showed that individuals with a history of AUD had higher, anxiety and depressive symptoms. And one of the mechanisms, we tested loneliness and social support as potential mediators, and we found that only loneliness was one of the pathways. And as a clinical psychologist, I always think about, okay, so what would be the implication? So one of the things that I'm very excited about is to kind of connect some of my clinical work here at the NIH and, try to translate it to informed practice. So, one of the one paper that I have in review right now is to talk about how we could select and adapt some of the DBT skills to treat addiction. So I'm excited to hopefully see that and share that with others in the future. I'd like to thank again for this opportunity to speak and share our work. I want to thank all the study participants, the NIAAA intramural program, and also especially the PI of the COVID study, Dr. Vijay Ramchandani and Dr. Nancy Diaz-Granados. And I have my contact information up there if you want to contact me with questions. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Dr. Luke. Please remember, if you have questions, submit them with the send live feedback. Those will come to my email and I'll ask them when we finish all of the speakers. Also, there was one question about where to find the agenda. If you go to our OBSSR webpage and click on this event, it will take you to you can see something for the registration. If you click on the registration page, there's a tab for the agenda that's available there. So if you are curious for the agenda, you can find it there. Next, I'm going to introduce Dr. Kristen Perry. She is a NIDA T32 postdoctoral fellow in the Prevention and Methodology Training Program within the Department of Biobehavioral Health at the Pennsylvania State University. Her research has assessed the development of aggression in early childhood and examined the role of peer risk and protective factors and autonomic nervous system coordination in predicting aggressive behavior. More recently, Dr. Perry has focused on the role of the prenatal period in the development of externalizing behavior and the use of quantitative methods in novel ways to better understand the impact of physiology and the environment in relationship with externalizing behavior across development. Dr. Perry's presentation today is inspired by her recent publication, Prenatal Tobacco-Cannabis Co-Exposure and Child Emotion Regulation, the role of child autonomic functioning and sensitive parenting, which was published in Developmental Psychology. So I'm going to welcome up Dr. Perry.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here today, and I'm really excited to share some of this research focused on prenatal tobacco and tobacco-cannabis co-exposure. So first, I want to provide the citation, as well as provide some disclaimers and thank my co-authors who were very influential in this work. The outcome of interest in this study was emotion regulation, and when I talk about emotion regulation, I'm really talking about two different components. The first is emotion regulation, which refers to changes in intensity and duration of emotions in response to environmental demands. And the second is lability negativity, which refers to rapid and exaggerated emotional responses and mood changes. And emotion regulation is a critical social emotional skill that's relevant to all aspects of health and development throughout the lifespan. In this study, I really addressed these questions through two aims. The first aim used a developmental cascade model, which is a type of model that posits that at each developmental stage, there are salient tasks, and a failure to meet those tasks at one developmental stage has downstream consequences to the next developmental stage. And I was specifically interested in testing two different pathways at these different levels of influence. So here's the overall model, and I'm going to kind of break down the two different pathways that I tested in this study. The first pathway was a regulation and reactivity pathway that posited that prenatal tobacco exposure and tobacco cannabis co-exposure, in addition to prenatal maternal negative mood, which often co-occurs with substance use, but also is a risk factor for child emotion regulation deficits on its own. So when I talk about the prenatal risks, I'm talking about those three different factors. So the prenatal risks were theorized to be associated with parasympathetic nervous system functioning in toddlerhood, which was then associated with emotional reactivity in later toddlerhood, and these emotion regulation outcomes at early school age. And I want to break down parasympathetic nervous system functioning because it was really a key mechanism in this study. The parasympathetic nervous system is known as the rest and digest system. And it was measured using respiratory sinus arrhythmia, which is the inner beat, heart rate inner beat in conjunction with respiration. And if you saw a bear in the wild or at the NIH campus, we would expect that your parasympathetic nervous system would withdraw. And practically, this should result in action in response to threats so that you could fight the bear or run from the bear. However, if you saw a puppy, and let's say you like puppies, we might expect that your parasympathetic nervous system would activate, and this would result in RSA augmentation. Practically, this would result in either bringing you to equilibrium or engagement with the puppy or the puppy's owners. And when thinking about the parasympathetic nervous system, it's really important to consider the context in which it is measured. And the first context of measurement in this study was baseline RSA. So this just reflects an individual's general ability to regulate. And there's a large body of literature that suggests that low baseline RSA is associated with poor emotion regulation or higher lability negativity. The second way I assess this in the current study is through RSA reactivity, which in this study refers to a change from baseline to a frustration task. And here's the actual task that was used. It's a gentle arm restraint paradigm. So toddlers came into the lab and they watched a video for 3 minutes, and then the paradigm started. A toy was placed in front of the toddlers and their arms were held so that they could not play with the toy. Then they were allowed to play with the toy, and then their arms were held again, and then they were allowed to play with the toy. So those two reactivity trials were averaged, and baseline values were subtracted from them to get an index of RSA reactivity. In regards to RSA reactivity, we find that the literature is more mixed, but generally a moderate amount of withdrawal may be adaptive. The second pathway of interest was a chronic environmental risk pathway. And given the prenatal risks in this study, I was particularly interested in examining chronicity and postnatal substance exposure, as well as chronicity and exposure to maternal negative mood. So both of these factors were theorized to be associated with higher levels of lability negativity or poor emotion regulation at early school age. And the second aim of the study was really focused on examining differential susceptibility theory. And this type of theory posits that neurobiological susceptibility functions as a moderator between environmental effects and developmental outcomes. Children who are more reactive are theorized to be more sensitive to both positive and negative context. And one way that this is sometimes explained is through metaphor with dandelions and orchids. And so if you know flowers at all, you know that dandelions flourish pretty much anywhere. So this is a picture of a dandelion on the side of a road. You can see it looks pretty good. And this is what we might consider a positive environment, so a dandelion in a flower field. And you'll notice that in both environments, it looks pretty similar. This is a metaphor for our less reactive children. So children who are less reactive are theorized to have relatively similar outcomes regardless of the environment that they're in. Whereas orchids are a metaphor for our more reactive children. So in the negative environment, they're going to have the worst outcomes of all. But in a positive environment, they're going to have the best outcomes. And in this study, I was particularly interested in differential susceptibility and sensitive parenting. Sensitive parenting is a parent's ability to recognize their child's needs and respond appropriately. Importantly, this is a target for many prevention and intervention efforts. So the hypothesis was that children who are more reactive are more likely to be sensitive to this positive context of sensitive parenting relative to those who are less reactive. And I assessed this through interactions with RSA and sensitive parenting. In terms of the sample, this was a sample of 247 mother-child dyads that were recruited in the first trimester of pregnancy. The sample was predominantly Black and single mothers, and people were recruited into 3 groups. There was a prenatal tobacco exposure group, a prenatal tobacco and cannabis exposure group, and then a demographic control group that was matched on maternal age and education. And the substance exposure groups were created based on 3 different methods. The first was maternal self-report of substance use. The second was maternal saliva. And the third was meconium. There are no group differences between the groups in regards to demographics, with the exception of race and ethnicity, where the demographic control group had the highest number of mothers of color. This study was pre-registered on the Open Science Framework, and it was a multi-method study, so I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on the different measures, but I'm happy to answer questions if people have them. Biological assays were used at all time points. Interviews were used at all time points. Assessor report was used at early school age, and I'll come back to that in a second. Physiological data was collected in toddlerhood. Maternal report was used at all time points. And teacher report was used at early school age. So in regards to emotion regulation, we had assessor report, teacher report, and maternal report. And assessor reports occurred after the lab session. So children came into a lab session at early school age. After that session, research assistants completed reports of children's emotion regulation. That comprises the assessor report. And then a path analysis was used to assess these aims. And a path analysis is a type of statistical technique where you regress the outcomes at one time period on the predictors at the previous time period. So it really allows us to examine prospective longitudinal differences. And onto the results. I'm going to break down this model a little bit based on the hypothesized pathways, but I just wanted to show the entire final model. Let's see if this. You'll notice the developmental period is at the top. It's harder to do than I would think. And then down here, I just want to point out that the model provided a good fit to the data. So onto that first potential pathway, the regulation and reactivity pathway. We found that low baseline RSA was associated with higher lability negativity, as we would expect. And we also saw this association between prenatal maternal negative mood and emotional reactivity in late toddlerhood. However, you'll notice that there are no pathways from the prenatal factors to early school age emotion regulation through these mechanisms. So overall, there was limited evidence for this pathway. And then in terms of the second hypothesized pathway, we found that prenatal maternal negative mood and tobacco-only exposure were associated with higher levels of postnatal maternal negative mood. And then postnatal maternal negative mood was negatively associated with emotion regulation, maternal report. So mothers who are reporting themselves as having more mood problems are rating their children as having worse emotion regulation skills. And this is what we had hypothesized. In terms of postnatal substance exposure, we saw that all the prenatal risks were associated with postnatal substance exposure. Postnatal substance exposure was associated with higher levels of lability negativity, as we had hypothesized. However, we also found this unexpected effect where higher levels of postnatal substance exposure were actually associated with better ratings of emotion regulation. And so this is not something that we had hypothesized. We had hypothesized it in the opposite direction. And one alternative explanation for this finding is that the type of substance might matter. So in a post hoc analysis, I looked at postnatal alcohol exposure, cannabis exposure, and tobacco exposure. And what we saw is that cannabis exposure is really what's driving this positive association. And this might be because there's some literature that suggests that cannabis can alter the validity of people's ratings of behavior. So mothers who are reporting more cannabis use might be perceiving their children's behavior in a different way. Additionally, this could be a statistical artifact. We're controlling for things like mood in the model. When we control for mood, what's left over, and cannabis exposure might be positively associated with emotion regulation. But definitely more work needs to be done to try to understand these types of findings. And then on to the second aim of the study, which was focused on that differential susceptibility theory. There was a significant interaction between RSA reactivity and sensitive parenting in predicting assessor-reported emotion regulation. And we have emotion regulation on the y-axis and sensitive parenting on the x-axis. So children who showed that RSA withdrawal, if you'll remember, that's that potentially more adaptive response to our frustration task. For those children, we see that sensitive parenting is associated with higher levels of emotion regulation. So these children who experience RSA withdrawal, they're getting that protected benefit from sensitive parenting. So these children might be our orchids. They're really sensitive to that positive context. Whereas children who showed RSA augmentation, that dotted line here, that's that potentially less adaptive response. For those children, there is no association between sensitive parenting and emotion regulation. So those children are getting no positive benefit from sensitive parenting. So these might be our dandelions. So overall, our findings suggest that postnatal chronic risk really played a critical role in findings. Particularly, we saw that postnatal substance exposure and postnatal maternal negative mood really mediated these associations between prenatal risks and emotion regulation. However, we had some unexpected findings, particularly regarding cannabis exposure, and more research really needs to be done to disentangle these associations and better understand the role of maternal mood versus substance exposure, which often co-occur. Overall, there is less evidence for the physiology and reactivity pathway, and some of this might be because of the timing of measurement. So in some of our prior work, we found that particularly co-exposure is associated with parasympathetic nervous system functioning in infancy. So the developmental timing here might be really critical. Additionally, we did see that baseline RSA predicted lability negativity as we had expected. So more research can be done to determine what really predicts baseline RSA for these children. We saw that there was that interaction between RSA reactivity and sensitive parenting and predicting emotion regulation. And I think this was really notable to us because it suggests that not all children are getting the same benefit from sensitive parenting. So it's really critical to figure out when these interactions might be most salient and what factors might be more impactful for which specific children. And in sum, consistent with Dr. Riley's legacy, it's really important to examine these different pathways and these multiple levels of influence, as well as interactions among these different levels of influence. So I'd like to thank the families first and foremost, but also NIDA who funded this work and funds my time. And then thank you again for having me here today.
Thank you, Dr. Perry. Okay, I think this is the right slide. So it's my pleasure to introduce our next ESI, Dr. Gianna. Rhea Sandin, who is a NIDA T32 postdoctoral fellow in the Department of Psychology at the University of Minnesota. Her program of research examines the complex interplay between biological and contextual influences that contribute to the development of youth self-regulation. I'm doing this without my glasses, so I'm gonna stretch my notes a little. She is interested in self-regulation as an intermediate phenotype link, genomics to outcomes, as well as understanding the neurobiology of executive functioning in the context of psychopathology. She's also passionate about the inclusion of underrepresented populations in psychological research and taking a strengths-based approach to understanding the various factors implicated in the development of socio-emotional competencies for children of all backgrounds. This presentation is inspired by her recent publication, Novel Measures of Family Orientation and Childhood Self-Regulation, a genetically informed twin study, which was published recently in the Journal of Family Psychology. Come on, do I have your right slide up here? Is this it? Oh, okay.
Okay, so my slides.
You might want to stand there. So that...
This is not how the slides are supposed to look, but I'm going to try to be a dandelion during this presentation and just be resilient. So thank you for having me. I'm really excited to share my work titled Novel Measures of Family Orientation and Childhood Self-Regulation, a Genetically Informed Twin Study. So familism is a multidimensional cultural construct primarily identified in Hispanic and Latinx families that centers around support, obligation, and reference to the family unit. A majority of the research on familism is conducted in adolescent samples, with very few research occurring in the middle childhood period. The few studies that do exist show that greater parent-reported familism is associated with greater prosocial behaviors and greater academic motivation. However, we know that children in middle childhood are beginning to develop their own value systems that contribute to the family unit. And so better measurement is needed outside of parent report to better understand youth endorsement of familism and how that may impact their development later on. Additionally, theory suggests that family cultural values shape children's socio-emotional development, and in particular, self-regulation. However, interestingly, there's very little research examining the links between cultural values and children's self-regulation. And the one explicit research study that I found was a mixed method study of Mexican-American families, and found that family cultural values were actually not associated with children's self-regulation. So again, more research is needed to better understand links between values and children's self-regulation, given the salient importance of self-regulation for not only children, but across the lifespan. And just to pivot a little bit, we know that self-regulation is influenced by genetic and environmental influences. Additionally, the cultural genomics perspective posits that nearly every cognitive or behavioral outcome is influenced by genetic, environmental, and cultural influences. However, the field of behavior genetics largely ignores the role of culture in understanding the etiology of complex human traits. And so this is where I hope my work can come in. And so sort of the broad overall question of this study was, are cultural processes within the family related to children's self-regulation? And so there were three main aims of the study. The first aim was to take a multi-method approach to create a novel measure of family orientation
and middle childhood. And this included coding parent-child interaction tasks, parent-reported measures, as well as observer reports. The second aim of the study was to understand whether family cultural values were associated with children's self-regulation. And I hypothesized that greater family orientation would be associated with more adaptive self-regulation. And then the third aim was to understand the genetic, environmental, and cultural interplay between family cultural values and children's self-regulation. And here I hypothesized that greater family cultural values would actually increase the environmental variance in children's self-regulation. So participants were drawn from the longitudinal Arizona Twin Project. And at the current wave that's included in this study, youth were about 8 years old. And these are twins from the state of Arizona. And about a third of the sample identified as Hispanic or Latino. And so, as I previously mentioned, familism is historically identified in Hispanic and Latinx families, but research has shown that familism shows measurement and variance across different types of families, as well as across different racial ethnic groups. And so, since the Arizona Twin Project includes a racially, ethnically, and sociodemographically diverse sample of families, I'm going to go ahead and call this construct family orientation. So the cultural process involving an emphasis on providing support, respect, obligation to the family system. Okay, so here for aim 1, I went ahead and included a bunch of measures that I thought might be indicative of family orientation that I will eventually include in an exploratory factor analysis. So first, there are parent-child interaction tasks that were already collected. And so a parent and each twin would just talk for about 7.5 minutes, and I developed a coding scheme in which we rated the extent that the conversation was indicative of family orientation. And so here I derived both parent family orientation as well as child family orientation. I also included the parent-reported Mexican-American Cultural Value Scale, which is a gold standard measure of family cultural values. And then I also included experimenter assessments of the parent-child dyad throughout the home visit. And so this would include things like how affectively matched was the parent with their child throughout the home visit? How compliant was the child with the primary caregiver and the experimenter? So those sorts of questions. And then measures of self-regulation included task-based executive functioning. So there was the flanker task, the continuous performance task, and digit span backward, as well as parent and teacher-reported effortful control, and which included activation control, inhibitory control, and attentional focusing. And so again, aim 1 used exploratory factor analysis to derive novel measures of family orientation. And I tested 1, 2, and 3 factor solutions, and I ended up going with the 2-factor solution. Given theoretical support for family orientation values as well as behaviors. So for values, we've got that parent-reported Mexican-American Cultural Value Scale, so support, obligation, and reference. Whereas behaviors included the child family orientation that was derived from the coded videotape, as well as those measures from experimenter observations of twin affect during the home visit. And so factor loadings that were above 0.3 were retained, and so whatever you see in those squares were retained as factors and carried out through the additional analyses. So for aim 2, which was to use multi-level regression analyses to understand whether family orientation was associated with self-regulation, interestingly, I found that family orientation values were not associated with children's self-regulation. However, family orientation behaviors were associated with better executive functioning performance, with the exception of digit span backward, as well as higher reported parent and teacher reported effortful control. And then aim 3, again, wanted to use the twinness of the sample to understand the genetic, environmental, and cultural interplay on between family orientation and youth self-regulation. And again, this aim is unique in that most studies can't get at this question, but given that there are twins, we can take a look. So the twin method is a powerful tool that allows us to use the extent that identical and fraternal twins are related to make assertions about the genetic and environmental contributions to our phenotype of interest. So very generally, identical twins share 100% of their genes, whereas fraternal twins share about, on average, 50% of their DNA. So if monozygotic or identical twins are more similar on a trait compared to fraternal twins, then we can assert that the trait is genetically influenced. However, if associations are comparable across identical and fraternal twins, then that tells us maybe the environment may be more important in explaining variation on the trait. And so what we can do is then decompose this information into a special case of structural equation modeling. And this is what we call a univariate twin model. So A stands for additive genetic influences, or this latent idea of a lot of genes influencing the trait. C is shared environment, or aspects of the environment that contribute to twin similarity. So things like being in the same classroom, playing the same sports. And C is the non-shared environment. So these are aspects of the environment that contribute to twin dissimilarity. So these are things like one twin getting an illness, attending different schools, and E also includes measurement error. And so, not shown here, we found that all the measures of self-regulation were influenced by additive genetic and non-shared environmental influences, so the A and E paths. And really interestingly, this has never been done before. We were able to decompose the variance on family orientation behaviors, given that there was a separate score for each twin. And what we find is, largely behaviors were influenced by environmental influences, but really interestingly is we also see this additive genetic influence, which is concordant with theory suggesting that even measures of the environment are to some degree genetically influenced. And the univariate twin model can also be extended to include the role of a moderator as shown by the triangles. And so what this tests is whether in this case, family orientation values and behaviors, does it moderate the additive genetic, shared environmental, and non-shared environmental influences on self-regulation. So kind of getting at that gene environment culture interplay. And interestingly, across all models, I found that family orientation values and behaviors did not moderate the etiology of children's self-regulation. So it seems that family orientation behaviors seem to be important for mean levels of self-regulation, but maybe not for the genetic and environmental etiology of regulation. And so for our discussion for aim 1, I was able to derive a novel measure of family orientation that goes beyond parent-reported measures. And for aim 2, in concordant with previous literature, I found that family orientation behaviors were associated with better children's self-regulation. So this suggests that children's behavior, family orientation behaviors or behavioral manifestations of their cultural values may be a really important and accurate way to assess their cultural values in middle childhood. And again, I did not find that family orientation behaviors was associated with digit span backward. Digit span backward assesses children's working memory, which working memory is shown to have a slower developmental progression compared to other self-regulatory processes such as inhibitory control. So it's possible that it's just too early to assess this association. And then in terms of aim 3, so examining the genetic, environmental, and cultural contributions to interplay between family cultural values and self-regulation. Again, I found that mean levels, that family orientation seems to be important for mean levels of children's self-regulation, but may not be salient for the etiology of self-regulation at this age. And so it'll be important to track this as youth enter into adolescence, a period of really rapid growth in self-regulation. So I'm going to be honest, I do not remember the strengths of the study. Some I can think of off the top of my head is that I really think this work is important to further the field of behavior genetics, in that it not only it includes a developmental perspective, genomic perspectives, but also culturally informed perspectives to better understand youth development for children across, a variety of different backgrounds. So the take-home message for today is family orientation is important for youth self-regulation. Thank you.
Thank you. We really appreciate your flexibility and tenacity there. I think these slides were correct when we uploaded them, but there's some sort of translation that's happening on this device that seems to have missed your font or something. That is what we have guessed, because as far as we can see on our computers, everything looks great. One option is we will probably, if you don't mind, we can make a PDF of your slides and attach it to our website so that people can go back and look at them, because we really appreciate that. And maybe you can review your strengths and we can discuss them in the discussion. And yeah, you obviously know your work very well because you were able to just talk about it off the top of your head. So thanks. So for the last of our presentations in our ESIs, we have Dr. Elise Tulien. She is a research assistant professor in the Institute for Firearm Injury Prevention at the University of Michigan. Dr. Tulien uses mixed behavioral science and data science methods to understand factors that enhance the risk of firearm-related injury in adolescent and emerging adults, and variations by intent, gender, and rurality, and the ways that technology and online spaces can exacerbate or be leveraged to reduce the risk of harm. Today, here I can actually forward that slide. Go. Today, her presentation is inspired by her article, Longitudinal Effects of Electronic Dating Violence on Depressive Symptoms and Delinquent Behaviors Across Adolescence, which was published in the Journal of Interpersonal Violence. And again, if you have any questions, please submit them into the online portal and we will be following up this presentation with our Q&A. So Dr. Tulane, if you want to come up. Okay.
Thank you all so much for having me here. That last presentation was amazing. I would not have been able to do such a performance without slides. So another round of a hand to my co-presenter. Great job. You proved that you were quite the dandelion. So it's kind of nice, actually, the progression of ages we've had for the past couple of presenters. We had kind of a younger age range than the middle age range, and now I'm going to talk to you all about adolescence. And I'm going to talk to you not about guns today, despite where I work. I'm going to be talking to you about something else that's really, I think, fundamentally important in how we think about the environmental influences that contemporary adolescents and children experience as well as adults. And that is, oh wait, I'm like, pulling myself. Well, we'll get to that, I guess. So adolescence is a time of a lot of change. There are quite a few things going on. Developmentally, we can see how we're transitioning from being very much, an individual that needs to be cared for into, gaining that autonomy, as well as the physiological changes that occur. Another important part of adolescence is the emergence of dating behaviors generally, or at least the interest potentially in those behaviors. And that, of course, is a new way of relating that extends beyond the other interpersonal, behaviors that youth will have had in their earlier child years. So we know that there are some major adolescent risk factors. These are not surprising to us. These are violence exposure, substance use, and then some mental health concerns. We also know that, modern adolescents are facing kind of a tough world right now. We've just had a major pandemic that's really exacerbated stress. We know that there's increases in depression and anxiety and other mental health concerns in our youth. We're consistently worried about substance use and new substances and access, including things like cannabis at this point. And we also know that violence is a major problem. This extends from anything from bullying to dating violence. But something that's missing from quite a bit of the existing literature is a very critical contextualizing feature. So we don't have too many people in the room, but even for those of us listening via Zoom, I'm guessing that the majority of you have something that is within 6 inches of your body, and that thing is a cell phone. I don't have mine, it's over there on the table, but it was within 6 inches of me when I was sitting down. So this is really important, and I know that we're adults, the majority of us in this room are adults, but we see that this feature is really important for adolescents. So these statistics are from 2022, so a couple years older now. But you can see that 95% of adolescents are having access to a smartphone, and usually it's their smartphone. And beyond just having a smartphone in their lives, youth spend a lot of time online and on screens. On average, it's 8 hours a day. And almost half of youth as of 2022 are saying that they're online almost constantly, which is substantially up from not even 10 years prior when it was only a quarter. So this phenomenon is highly prevalent. It's taking up a lot of their time, and we're seeing increases in the amount of time they're having. And I unfortunately don't have the slide in this slide deck right now, but I do want to note that there are concerns around disparities, which are incredibly important to acknowledge. I think earlier, 10 years ago, maybe even 5 years ago, there was a lot of concern about access and disparities in access. And while there still are some disparities by access, now the disparities we're actually seeing is in the amount of time being spent online, with often of children of color spending more hours online as compared to their white peers. And so again, thinking about the amount of exposure and what they're doing online is really, really important, particularly as we think about disparities. So tech in these adolescent lives. Now, it's not all bad. And I'm not here to tell you that the internet's a bad thing, that social media is bad, because it's not. There are a lot of really great things that can happen online, which is why we like it so much. We all spend time scrolling, right? We can chat with our friends and our family. Think about, a parent needing to text their kid, like, hey, I'm going to pick you up instead of your other parent or your other caregiver, whatever it is. That's really helpful. They can stay in touch with friends, etc. you can get information online. A lot of us are watching through an online portal right now. And this is a really critical piece of our education system, both formal and informal. And then, of course, entertainment. We all experienced COVID. We had our years of pandemic where we were Netflixing a lot of the time, you know, gaming, getting to watch TV, YouTube, etc. Those are all things that can be done that can help relieve stress at times and kind of take some time out of the quote unquote real world and have a bit of a break. And those can all be positive things. But there are some harmful experiences that can also occur online. And today we're going to be talking about some of those interpersonal ones within dating spaces. So what is cyber dating violence? Why should we care about it? Well, it's pretty prevalent. So this is from a meta-analysis from, I think, a year or maybe 2 years ago at this point, but more than a quarter of youth are reporting either perpetration or victimization. We don't have a nationally representative statistic at this point. It would be ideal if we did, but we are seeing more surveys starting to pull questions about, you know, cyber dating violence into their, you know, batteries. So hopefully we'll see more of these statistics coming out. They are really important to track over time, because it's not only that it's prevalent. Oops. Okay. Well, I'll get to that. So when we say cyber dating violence, like, what do we mean? Well, there's a lot of different terms out there. Digital dating abuse, electronic dating violence, cyber dating violence. These are all different terms. The field hasn't yet agreed upon what we want to call it. We're having a hard time completely defining it because, one, technology changes really fast, as is social media. Two, new forms of kind of negative behaviors emerge frequently. But for now, we can think about it as kind of a series of behaviors ranging from tracking and monitoring that can be active, where, you know, you're demanding someone's password and you're keeping tabs on them, to something that's a bit more passive, where you're kind of just keeping, you're watching someone as they tag themselves and geotag themselves and kind of keeping an eye on or seeing who's you're talking to each other, you know, via comments, et cetera, that are publicly visible. There's intimidation, there's sexual coercion, also known as coercive sexting. So that can be the demanding of illicit images, which at, you know, the under age 18 federally is a federal crime. Taking a picture of yourself, you know, as an adolescent, you know, in terms of an illicit picture or explicit picture, is a federal crime, and sharing it is distribution of child sexual material, so that becomes really tricky as well, but also that can then be reshared, etc. So there's a lot of forms. This is kind of what this is to tell you. And it's really important that we capture distinct forms to better understand both the prevalence of those forms, but also how they impact health and well-being. And the other thing to note is that this behavior is occurring by, on average, the age of 16. So we hypothesize in another paper that the reason why it's you know, the peak of these exposures are at age 16 is because that is the age that many youth start driving. So all of a sudden, you might be a little bit less reliant on your devices, and we might, and we see in other literature increases at around age 16, 17 of physical forms of dating violence. So there might be a trade-off here. As, you know, youth get more autonomy and are able to physically be out in the world with less supervision, we might see a trade-off between the digital versus the physical. But because it's age 16 is the average age of exposure, we need to capture from early adolescence through later adolescence. So our big research question is, what does this look like over time, and how does that impact mental health and behaviors over time? So we pulled our data from the Strengthening Healthy Adolescent Relationship Experiences Share study. This is a 4-year prospective longitudinal study. It was designed as following 2 different cohorts. So it's an accelerated cohort design, which is pretty exciting. And the younger cohort was started being followed at age 12, and they were followed through age 15. The older cohort started at age 15, was followed through age 18. And you can see it's about half and half female. The race distribution is about the same between the 2 groups. And these youth were going to school in Southeast Michigan. And they were recruited from the PIs of the study determine school district levels of risk relative to a bunch of different public indices and measures in terms of thinking about kind of the environmental and structural risks potentially being exposed. And then we sampled from each of those 3 risk levels. And I can talk about that more if in the Q&A if people are interested. But for this particular study, we did mixed effects models and stratified by cohort. And we used youth to set the random intercept because we know there's variability among youth, and then looking at over time the trajectory. And our big questions are, we have these 3 forms of cyber dating violence that we specifically wanted to look at. Prior work that we've done helped to define these 3 different forms of cyber dating violence as distinct and unique. So we have some papers out about that, as well as their trajectories across time. But, you know, as you saw earlier from that other analysis, we saw also peaks around age 16 of these 3 types of behaviors. And we really want to know, again, what's the effect on depressive symptoms and delinquent behaviors? Because while I can stand up here and tell you it's really important, I do need to show you some data in order to kind of get the NIH to want to fund this kind of stuff, right? We also needed to control, obviously, some important covariates. And one thing that makes me really excited about this study is that we were able to control for physical and in-person forms of dating violence. So we account for other forms of dating violence, including their physical dating violence. So that is, being hit, being slapped, being punched. Emotional dating violence, so being called names verbally in person, which is similar to electronic, like cyber harassment, which is being called names online, but it's the in-person part that's unique. Sexual dating violence is, of course, forms of sexual aggression. Then we had ACEs, and we divided them as threat-based ACEs and deprivation-based ACEs. This is an area that people are getting more interested in because not all ACEs are the same. And kind of to our first presenter, Dr. Luke's point about measurement, we can be thoughtful about how we want to kind of do different measures in terms of combining things or having classifications. And then we also had gender, and as a reminder, we stratified by cohort. So what did we find? Well, it turns out that cyber harassment and that cyber monitoring did not have an effect on depressive symptoms across time when controlling for our covariates. But the cyber sexual coercion, which is the demanding of those images from a dating partner and doing it so coercively, did have a positive effect over time. And again, this is a 4-year longitudinal cohort, so this is across multiple years of adolescence. For our delinquent behaviors, what we found was that cyber harassment, again, still wasn't significantly associated with delinquent behaviors over time. But again, the cyber sexual coercion was, as was cyber monitoring. And cyber monitoring is demanding of passwords and forcefully monitoring posts and other things. And again, we controlled for our covariates there. So kind of just summarize this, cyber sexual coercion is really, really important. This kind of echoes some of the in-person dating violence work that's been done, that has shown that sexual forms of violence have the greatest magnitude of effect often. They're really important during this age because often these are the preliminary exposures to sexual experiences. And so we want our youth, of course, to have positive, sexual experiences when they're starting to date. But I think because there's a lack of experience and because of stigma and other kind of influential factors, these primary experiences are really, really influential. We also found that cyber monitoring was influential on delinquent behaviors. And this is important, again, because this is a more forceful form of being monitored. And so the fact that it's significantly associated with other delinquent behaviors suggests that these behaviors might be clustering together, particularly, and I can talk about this a little later, but our different dating violence variables were perpetration and or victimization. So that might be kind of driving that relationship. So our big conclusion is that these cyber dating violence constructs are unique. They add unique exposures, even when you control for the physical forms of dating violence. We do need to be collecting data about this. We need to be following this across time, particularly given how important the online world is to our modern day youth. We have some other projects going on. So one thing we're looking at is gaslighting and ghosting. These are 2 other constructs that are important. There's a bunch of other ones. As I said earlier, new forms of this come up all the time. And so this is kind of the exciting part of being a scientist and being willing to kind of create new measures and think about, measurement across time and really responding to our environment and being willing to show up for those kind of different levels of influence and thinking about those. I think it's really important that we get national data collected about this, and we want to have national estimates, particularly given that there are disparities in exposures, and we imagine that there could be disparities that would be really important, but we can't study those unless we have that national data to better understand that. So with that, I'm going to say thank you so much, and hand it back over to Lauren.
Not sure what I need in my notes, but just in case I forget to read something. So thank you all so much. I want to thank all my ESIs for their interesting presentations. And we now have a Q&A session set up. I think there we go. So please go ahead and send any questions through the send live feedback email. If there's anyone in the room that would like to ask a question, I'm going to ask my ESIs to come. We didn't think this out very well, so we're going to cluster you here, if you don't mind coming up. And then it looks like one of my colleagues is here at the microphone. So if anyone else, we have 2 microphones that we can use to ask questions. Yeah, I guess you can just stand up here. So thank you. Dr. Schlosser.
Yes, so I'm Dina Schlosser from OBSSR, and I have a question for Dr. Reyes-Sandin, but it could be any of you also could pipe in where it is appropriate. So I know you talked about familial, I cannot get that word out, which I think is a very interesting concept, and I'm really excited that you talked about other cultures also having this. I wanted to see if you had thought, or any of y'all have thought about the importance of other individuals that may not be technically family. So I know you were talking about with Hispanic families, and you have this very family focused, and a lot of times it's, you have a pretty good sized family group. I'm thinking about individuals, even myself, for instance, a single mom that moves to a strange city. I find myself collecting my tribe around me. So they may not be genetic family, but bigger. Have you thought about these types of relationships and those kind of moderating effects as well?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really great question. And I think it's something we need to consider as the landscape changes. Family structures have changed. We're more transient now. We're all over the place. And so, yeah, families look a little different. We're relying on social media for our family support. So, yeah, in future research, not only am I going to continue to focus on just measurement in general, but yeah, considering how people outside of blood family, may be really important in forming these cultural values around those around us.
Okay, mine's for Dr. Jeremy Luke. Chance to show off some of your clinical skills. I had some questions about study about COVID and coping with COVID. And I think for a lot of us, my observations are that kind of like with Encanto, remember, we don't think about Bruno. A lot of us don't want to think about COVID, don't want to talk about COVID, don't want to think about it. And when we think about different types of coping, there's maladaptive coping where you just deny things that happen, or, try to repress it. And maybe they're more proactive kinds of ways to cope. I think about in terms of treating trauma with prolonged exposure, actually thinking about the thing that's bad helps to overcome it. So I just wanted you to talk a little bit about, as people look back on COVID epidemic, have you done a little work on coping or with some of these stressors, what might be ways to mitigate that? Maybe you've researched it, maybe you just know from your own clinical experience and expertise that you might want to comment on that.
Yeah, that's a really great question. And we did one late in class analysis on COVID-related stress. We actually have a different paper that analyzed, I think, 5 different items, also from the CDC questionnaire bank, which was focused on positive coping. I don't remember all the items off the top of my head, but when we did the latent class analysis, we found about like 80% and 20% two classes. The 20% latent class had pretty much like when individuals have positive coping is across the board, and then negative coping, like not utilizing the positive coping mechanisms, it would be those 20%. The things that people use, the items would be things like, meditation, engaging in positive behaviors like exercising and kind of other lifestyle, positive coping mechanisms. So we do have a different analysis of that positive coping. I think clinically, one of the things that I hear the most is the lack of structure during COVID. If someone was going to work and there was a structure, you see other people. Now during COVID is you stayed at home, there's no structure, you're bored. If you drink, no one can see it. It presents a situation where, especially for individuals with alcohol use disorder, it's easy to then have a slip or a relapse. So that would be some of the thoughts that I have in response to the question. Hopefully that answers it. Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm Mike Starrett, and I'm from the NIMH. And congratulations to you all. These are just excellent projects and outstanding work. It's a pleasure to hear and to see these today. Also, it's great to see some of the themes from your talks this morning, themes around mental health, around children and young people, and around innovations in methodology. It's just fantastic to see. I guess I have a similar question to Dr. Simoni, and this one for Dr. Perry and also for Dr. Thulin. Dr. Perry, I'm wondering, based on your results, if you have particular implications and ideas about what we should proceed with in terms of family, child, or parenting interventions as a result of your work? Go ahead.
Yes. So as I've gotten more into this work, this is something I've been thinking a lot about, because a lot of parenting interventions were developed with the idea that this should work for all children. And we know now, especially a lot of those interventions were based mainly on white families and without the kind of cultural sensitivity we now know is necessary to have successful interventions. But also just looking at these interactions between physiology and environmental effects, what we see in my study and in many other studies is that children are not reacting to their environment in the same way. And so we need to do a better job at tailoring interventions for certain children and families. And I think that also means really identifying unique strengths that families have within this bigger cultural framework. So I think we can really take this work by looking at physiology as well as family context and even the cultural context, as we heard about today.
Thank you. And for you, Dr. Thulin, you're helping us to better understand, we've known that there are these complications, difficulties, even maybe some pernicious effects of like social media use on mental health, especially for young people. And I think you're helping us to understand not just whether that happens, but what and how. And that's really where the science needs to go. So given that you do see some associations in your work, particularly between, this particular kind of, sexual, I forget how you phrased it, coercive, yes, the coercive sexting. How do we respond to that kind of challenge? Do we work with the young people, with families, all of the above? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, the $1 million question, or maybe $1 billion question. I'm not clear how much TikTok might sell for. We in the United States are behind in terms of our policies. So the EU has done a pretty good job of moving forward policies around data rights, data regulation, particularly for young people when it comes to social media. to the point where the product you get in Europe, in the EU, of, like the Meta product, is actually a bit different now than the product you're getting in the United States. And now sociologists and I think other political scientists are thinking about the internet relative to the splinter net, where we no longer have just this one giant sea of online space that people can navigate, but we're actually going to have pods of this, I guess. As more regulation happens and more decisions are made on a country by country level or even a state by state level. So for example, Montana blocked TikTok, banned TikTok, last year, I think. While I always want us to find solutions that help youth feel empowered and able to navigate the lives that they're in, because those are really important critical skills. And I want parents to be able to support that. I think we can't just relegate this to kids and their parents. Like, this is a bigger problem. And yes, again, like, let's create interventions that help. But if we put it on families, we know that we have exacerbation of disparities. Not all parents are able to be with their, adolescents after school. That's not a reality. So we need policies that are going to help. And we also need citizens to stand up and say, like, in the United States, this is how this works. Policies happen because we have advocacy. So that's a really important part of this. And it's really, really hard to monitor social media in the United States right now based on how those APIs are written. I have a computational degree, so I do some of that, my other job, but, maybe don't mean my other job, but like my other hat at the university. So this is something we think about a lot. And we definitely need some policies. Thanks.
Well said, and thank you very much.
This is a question for Dr. Perry. What are the implications of environment and physiology interactions as found in your study for intervention efforts?
Yeah, well, I think I touched on this a little bit. I really think it's important for interventions, when people are designing interventions, is to look at these individual by intervention effects. And I know that's something in the literature that's been started to be conducted a lot more. But trying to think about what are the ways that we can try to identify which children are maybe our more reactive children and which children are less reactive children, so that we can tailor interventions to those children. So for example, we know now with smartwatches, a lot of this physiology data is more readily and easily accessible for children and their families, but also researchers and healthcare providers. So that could be a mechanism for the future. A lot more research needs to be done to help us understand and apply this environment by physiology approach to intervention work.
Thank you. Is there any other questions in the room? Okay.
Actually, I'm going to bring Dr. Perry back up again. Oh, sorry. Just stay. You talked about, thank you all for your talks. They were all really interesting. But you were answering a question a minute ago about across families.
Roz, I don't think it's on. Or just put it closer to your mouth.
Is that better?
That's better.
That's better. Thank you. You answered a question a minute ago and you talked about across families. And I was wondering about within families. I was trying to figure out, were you dealing with first-time parents or did they already have kids? And then how does the parent think about, I learned something, like you have these great interventions and I learned something for one kid and now this kid's different.
Yes. So in regards to the first question, these families were not only first-time parents, but some were first-time parents. So there was no exclusion criteria based on the amount of children people already had. It was really based on the substance exposure. That was really what we were trying to collect within the study. But in regards to your second question, I'm going to kind of put on my clinical hat a little bit. So I'm also a child clinical psychologist by training, and I did a lot of intervention work with children who have disruptive behavior problems, who are very young in early childhood. And oftentimes parents would come and they would say that exact thing, which is that I had one child and they're behaving this way, and then this other child has a completely different set of needs. And one thing we always try to emphasize to parents is that it's really a bi-directional relationship, because parents often feel a lot of guilt sometimes for their children's misbehavior. But that's not the case. Certain children bring different things to the table, particularly regarding temperament, And that's going to cause parents to react a certain way. So what we really want to try to do within intervention work is give parents skills to help maximize the positive impacts with their children. And so I think that looks differently based on what your child is bringing to the table. So some kids are really easy. They would never need an intervention because they'll listen the first time. You never really have to do anything. Whereas other families are going to need more support and help. And I think that that's really where also intervention work needs to be tailored to those families and thinking about how we as therapists can help them instead of just giving them all this knowledge maybe they did not ask for.
You're all looking at me expectantly. Okay. Dr. Rhea Sandin. I think I'm calling you up on the gauntlet here. Okay. What are some ways in which behavior genetic research can inform intervention and prevention efforts?
There's all this really great talk about precision medicine, and genetics is another way in which that can happen. Unfortunately, the field right now, advances really only benefit European ancestry individuals. And so I think more proximally, my work, just kind of opens up the discussion for behavior geneticists, both who do twin studies as well as molecular genetic work, not only to include more representative samples, but to just be more thoughtful about measurement and thoughtfully discussing genetically informed research with various populations. In terms of other ways that behavior genetics can benefit intervention and prevention efforts, behavior genetics has so many cool, novel, creative ways, to kind of get at genetic and environmental influences. And so, for example, you can sort of parse out the role of genetic influences, and what you're left with are these specific environmental mechanisms, that are leading to your phenotype of interest. And so those are the contexts to intervene on. And so I think those are, some ways in which the field can benefit families.
Are there any other questions in the room, or this will be our, oh, come on up.
As long as there's the chance. Just one extra question for Dr. Luke. It's so interesting to see the latent class models approach by being able to differentiate different kinds of participants in their situations. Was it that almost half of the people reported having very little impact of COVID on their lives? And not to be too flip, but I guess who are these people? Who is this 50% that's saying it didn't have a big impact in their lives? And I just wonder if you can tell us any more.
Yeah, so that's a great question. When we have these latent classes from latent class analysis, we sort of impose the labels onto the classes. So if you actually look at the item probabilities, the latent class, which I labeled minimal COVID-related impact, they did report, there is a good proportion of them who reported some kind of changes in their work environment, and not necessarily in the negative direction. So I think even for those, I think it's 52%, it's not like there's like no impact at all, but it didn't really affected their financial situation as much. Like we thought maybe they have some savings, right? One of the findings that I thought in terms of looking at the kind of different groups and who were members in different classes, one of those about the income, I thought was really powerful because it was the over 75K group. There was no one, not even one person, who were classified into the class 4, which in the subsequent analyses, we saw that the class 4 was the class that had much more elevated outcomes in terms of mental health, alcohol-related outcomes, and worse quality of life. So perhaps, individuals who may have a little bit more financial resources during COVID, it affected them, but not to a degree that they couldn't pay for their rent or their gas. They had some financial buffer. So I think this really gets at the question of measurement. We have these items from the CDC, and when we run a model, what does it really tell us? When we find 4 different classes and one of those says minimal or like not a lot of impact, it doesn't necessarily mean there's no impact at all, but perhaps the items were not capturing some of the ways the pandemic was influencing the individual. Thank you.
Okay. Our final question is for Dr. Tulien. What makes the online space so unique in its role in adolescent violence exposure?
Yeah, so a lot of the work that we've seen in the violence space, especially in the dating violence space, was during a time when there wasn't really an online space. So if you think about it, if you took a picture of yourself that was in some way explicit and you gave it to your partner and they showed it to some friends, that would probably cause distress. But in theory, you could get that physical photo back and destroy it, burn it, shred it, whatever. Even if they made physical copies, you could, in theory, collect every single copy back. The online space is not like that. Not only is it kind of, it is permanent, but you can share information at any time of day. We know that the majority of youth get online during what are quote unquote normal sleeping hours between 11 p.m. and 6 a.m. They're online, at least for a little bit, right? So any time of day you have access, you can click one button and share with tens, hundreds, thousands of people, and you can never get it back. Like it's out there. And so the reach, just in terms of the frequency in which you can engage, you can send tens, hundreds and thousands of texts in a single day back and forth. So if you're sending someone harassing messages or you're receiving harassing messages, you can be receiving them constantly. New accounts, you might be able to block, as an individual who's being harassed, you could block one account and then another account could pop up and start harassing you. Or someone could borrow a friend's account and you think you're talking to someone else who ends up being, wanting to, inflict, aggressive behavior against you. So the online space is just really unique and very different from the kind of in-person spaces that we've studied traditionally in violence research. And so they're really, really important and they're incredibly ubiquitous. I also want to say, we did this research before large language models were really more mainstream. Large language models are underpinning a lot of the AI facilitated tools that youth are actively using. So that's anything from like ChatGPT to DALL-E, like image generation. We know that there are things like deepfakes. That is a whole new kind of area of this where you can start to now create images, videos, text, using AI that looks very real, that's not based on an actual image and actual things said, et cetera. And we see this play out in a lot of different ways, but when we think about violence, it's also really important to understand and capture. And kind of going back to the other question about what do we do about it? Well, ideally we address it from multiple levels. We work with our youth, we work with parents and educators. We work with adults, training them to better understand these spaces because we didn't grow up with these spaces. They're new to us as well. And so I think a lot of adults feel underprepared for how to deal with that. And they also need the education. And then we go to our policymakers.
Stay. I kind of wanted to follow up on that. Is there an effort to also inform law enforcement? Because I think sometimes law enforcement might not think that cyber stalking or cyberbullying is, as big a deal as, somebody who leaves, presents at your house or however people stalk. I don't know, but I'm just curious about that.
Yes. So I think it depends on which law enforcement you're talking about. I think the federal government probably has some of the more robust definitions at this point. And then, state by state, county by county, it can vary. But one thing I will say is that some of the other work I do is on anonymous reporting systems. So this is basically where youth can submit information about concerning behavior in their community, in their school, to this kind of like amorphous, anonymous, confidential system, and then someone's told. That's the general premise. A lot of it's based off of social media. And so I think, these like receipts are starting to get to law enforcement a little bit more directly through those types of reporting mechanisms. where they can see, oh, okay, this is what this is, and this is what this is implying. And especially for something like a school shooting, we know that, you know, the online space is really important. So I think as we see kind of, you know, very, very sad, but also very powerful examples of how these things play out, it's easier to kind of have those stories have a direct impact and influence our law enforcement. But I don't know yet of like national trainings for all law enforcement on like cyber sexual stalking, things like that. Thanks.
Okay, I don't think we have any. This is the last chance for questions. Okay. So I want to thank again all of our ESI honorees for traveling here to DC and giving your talk through some difficult times for some of you, but you persevered. And we really appreciate all these really interesting talks today. So let's give them one more final. And we're finishing about 10 minutes early, so we are going to go on break, and we're going to reconvene at 2:50. So ignore. Sorry, 3:50. I'm looking at this thing right here, which says 2:50. Sorry, I'm reading on the screen. So in 10 minutes, and we will reconvene with our distinguished lecturer. So take a break. Thank you.
Welcome back, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm Erica Spots of OBSSR and the chair of the Matilda White Riley Distinguished Lecturer Selection Committee. Welcome to the 17th Matilda White Riley Distinguished Lecturer. The recipient of this award has a research career that has advanced behavioral and social scientific knowledge in areas within NIH's mission. The recipient's research also follows Dr. White Riley's vision through an expanded conceptualization of health and well-being that includes cognitive, affective, and social functioning and quality of life, behavioral and social sciences research results that improve the lives of people in society, illuminating the complex and dynamic interplay among processes at multiple levels, influence of social and behavioral factors on physical health and the utility of this knowledge for clinical practice and health policy, life course perspectives on development, health, and well-being of individuals and societies, and research approaches that build theory and methods in the advancement of knowledge on health and well-being. The NIH community nominates researchers for this award, and the recipient is then selected by a committee that I need to thank now. And that committee includes Elizabeth Barr, Gregory Greenwood, Valerie Mahomes, and Mariella Shirley. This committee volunteers their time and effort to reading all the nominations and then selecting one from among many deserving nominees. I'd like to thank this year's committee for their service. If we could give them a quick round of applause. And now it's with great pleasure that I present to you this year's Matilda White Riley Lecturer, Dr. Bernice Pescasolido. Dr. Pescasolido is Distinguished Professor of Sociology at Indiana University and founding director of the Indiana Consortium for Mental Health Services Research and the new IRSE Institute that targets research in socio-medical sciences. She is an elected member of both the National Academy of Medicine and the National Academy of Sciences. Trained as a medical sociologist at Yale, her research focuses broadly on how social networks and culture provide insights into health, illness, and healing phenomena, and more specifically on 4 areas: stigma, suicide, healthcare use, and healthcare systems. Her concerns have spanned local, national, and international questions and problems, primarily targeting mental illness. A Q&A session will follow Dr. Pescasolido's presentation. We welcome questions from both virtual and in-person attendees. And then, do we have the technical support slide? Well, the technical support slide will be up in after the talk. Oh, or maybe I can make it happen. Hold on. Uh-oh. One moment, please. What do you think? I'm sorry, we have a brief technical difficulty. Yeah, it worked a few minutes ago.
Yeah, it was working fine.
Oh, there. It showed the, there we
Okay.
go.
Technology has its glitches.
Okay, but oh, never mind.
Yeah. So if I was up there, not was there.
Okay. Sorry about that, everyone. Virtual attendees may submit a question anytime during the presentation. To submit a question, virtual attendees may select Send Live Feedback icon on the NIH videocast page and enter your comment or question, which we will receive in real time. During each Q&A session, we will alternate in-person with virtual questions. I am happy now to ask Dr. Pesca-Salido to come to the podium to receive her award. So rather than take up precious time, I will turn the stage over to Dr. Pesca-Salido to begin her presentation. Thank you so much.
Okay. All right, thank you. And I want to thank the IT guy because I'm not like the younger generation. If these slides hadn't come up, I would have gone home. I will say one thing about my technical prowess, though, which is 30 years ago, I was smart enough to birth a child who grew up to be an IT guy. So, Joe, I know you're listening. Mom's here. Thank you. I should have brought you with me. Okay, let me just start by saying that Matilda White Riley was a legend even when I was in graduate school. I never really got the opportunity to know her well, but she was a founder of two important parts of sociology, which is my home discipline, medical sociology and the sociology of aging. Now, I must say, based on my own ignorance, that I had heard about this award, but I never really thought about it much because I assumed it was in aging, which was, of course, Matilda's, where she just paved the road for everybody else. But in addition, she also paved the road in the idea of looking beyond the person, beyond the individual, outside the individual, to the things that would affect their health and would affect how they understood what was happening to their body and their mind. So that was one of the reasons I never really knew much about this award, because I assumed it was an award for aging research, which is not what I do. So I decided that one of the things I needed to do when I got this incredible letter was to sort of dig down and see who got this award in the past. And it was amazing. The inaugural award went to David Mechanic. Soon after that, it went to John McKinley. Both of those people, not my formal mentors, were incredibly influential in my career. And I really want to thank them for that. You go a little later, and our scientists in our sister disciplines of psychology, people like Terry Moffat and Tony Antonucci. I think most people know Tony Antonucci's social convoy model. What you probably don't know is her generosity and her willingness to meet with somebody, me, when we were doing the first national stigma study. And I knew that there had been a stigma study. It wasn't exactly a stigma study, but a study called Americans View Their Mental Health that was commissioned by the Joint Commission of Congress in 1949. And I called Tony out of the blue and said, do you have those original surveys anywhere? Because I knew that University of Michigan has an incredible repository of materials, including interview schedules. And not knowing me at all, we drove there, and Tony really was an incredibly generous person. And then finally, my contemporary, one of my colleagues, David Williams. So looking at the list, I am so deeply honored to be part of this group. I also wanted to say something about OBSSR. It's clear that I will never be a historian. I'm not very good with dates and things, but from my own personal reconstruction of the time, I don't know if people understand how important OBSSR was to us. Because at that time, the socio-environmental lab that had been at NIMH was dissolving before that. And that the traditional, very broad training programs in place in things like medical sociology were also going by the wayside, being replaced by a much more narrow view of what some of the NIHs did. And for NIMH, it was serious and persistent mental illness. which is not what many of us in medical sociology were doing at the time. And so there was a tremendous move back at that point to looking at psychiatric biological factors. And a lot of us wondered whether there was any place for us in the NIH. About that time, and I was about 10 years into my career, OBSSR was founded, and it made us feel like we had a home. And I just want to thank the people who founded it and the people who keep it alive and the people who keep it so vibrant for allowing us to bring our expertise, we hope, to help the health of this nation. So before I go down a deep rabbit hole on issues of social networks, which is my area, I did want to talk a little bit about human interaction and the focus on that, because it has a very twisted history of starts and stops, and there have been contributions and progress, but there have also been challenges. So one of the things that we know is that this is a very ancient idea, that back in the Roman Empire, that one of the moral philosophers said that the thing that helps people be healthy or get better is the affection of his friends. And this has been a common theme throughout the early history, the early medical and health history of populations. But when we came down to the rise of scientific Western allopathic medicine, there were two possible ways that we could go. And there was this battle for medical dominance. On the left, you had the social physicians headed up by Rudolf Virchow, talking about how medicine is essentially a social science. And on the other side, you had Louis Pasteur talking about anthrax and germ theory. We know who won that battle, right? It was not the social physicians, but there was always a stalwart group of social physicians, and then joined later by public health epidemiologists, that really kept that alive. And so I think now, at this point in time, it's undisputed that we understand that we can talk both about of health and healthcare systems and healing being affected both by forces inside the body, but also by forces outside the body. But there is this continued tension about where we should focus. I took a quick look at the NIH roster of possible applications, and I think the prominence of, I think it's now undisputed that relationships matter. There are over 50 current PAs, RFAs that have something to do with social support, social networks. We can think about two recent workshops that were held, one at the NIA that was organized by Bria Perry from the Ursay Institute, where I am, and Tom Valenti from USC. We can talk about NIDDK, where they put together a group to look at the influence of social factors on the illnesses and diseases that they focus on. We can also think about the internal program at NIH and the pioneering work done by people like Laura Cayley at the Genome Research Institute, which looked very early on and continues to look at how we leverage people around people to get them to understand the kinds of genetic problems that they might face in their families. So I think it's really important that we now see a varieties of flavors of looking at personal relationships, whether we're talking about social support, which of course, Sidney Cobb, the famous epidemiologist in the 1970s, Len Perlin and the social stress model, social networks, I'll go into in more detail than you want later. Whether we talk about network science, kind of a latecomer at the end of the last century, or we talk about connectedness. And there, I think it's really important to talk about the 2011-2012 focus of the CDC on connectedness as a way to think about suicide. Now, this is even sort of spread now. The dissemination has spread to the biological sciences, where a recent paper in Nature Communications showed that using this incredible data set of over 1,000 species, finding that, in fact, groups that live together tend to have greater longevity than groups that live alone. And so they talk about this as the molecular basis for the influence of social organization on longevity. However they see it, I'm taking it as one of our wins and some of the progress that we've made in terms of understanding the idea of interconnection as part of what influences life and death. Now, that comes with disputed origins of who invented the study of social relationships. Is it Auguste Comte, the founder of sociology, who said, I'm going to talk about the laws of interaction? Or the educational psychologists who were the first to look at kindergartners and how they played together, mathematicians who talked about graph theory, psychiatry, Jacob Moreno's talk about the dramaturgical view of people's lives. Again, latecomers, physicists now really centrally involved in understanding network connections and big data. I think the point here is not to argue about this because there have been plenty of arguments about who really founded this area. But I think the point is to understand that there are ebbs and flows in how much social relationships are seen as being important in trying to understand health and illness. And sometimes when biology is seen, because sometimes it's sort of misaligned. It's a little seen as misaligned with the biological view until recently. And I'm going to argue it's not at all misaligned with that we can find a very strong relationship between the social and the biological by thinking with a network perspective. Okay, so let me get down to business and sort of our understanding of health and healthcare. And for me, there are really two foundational theories. You know, my philosopher is Rodin, right? The sculptor who said, you know, I invent nothing, I rediscover. And for me, there are two very strong sociological foundations for understanding the role of social networks. One comes from Georg Simmel around 1927 when he said society arises from the individual and the individual from association. And what he said was that there were two basic forms of social network. The first one, which was concentric circles, and that represents pre-modern society, right? So by the virtue of where you were born, your family was defined, your occupation was defined, your church was defined, your place of residence was defined. Now that came with some real strengths, which is you really knew who you were, right? And you really know what your place was in the world. The problem was, and thinking about some of my research on stigma, it also meant that if you weren't part of that concentric circle, everybody else was considered dangerous, polluting, problematic, right? With modern society, he talked about how choice and the individual became more important. And so a person's identity is now formed by the intersection of social circles. And so that makes them more sort of sophisticated, more developed. And what with this comes with more uncertainty, more concerns about things, about who you are. When we looked at this, Beth Rubin and I thought about this in light of, you know, we thought maybe social science was burning down with the postmodern critique in the 1990s. And so we sort of took this on and said, well, what do we get from this by thinking this way? Well, the first thing we thought was there may be another social structure that Simmel didn't anticipate. And that was the postmodern social structure where the individual is so free to connect themselves to different groups that really the social safety net under them is actually pretty weak. But more importantly, I think what we saw in this was that these are not just historical structures. These are potential structures in contemporary society that have different implications for Beth, homelessness policy, which she studied, and mental health policy, which I studied. And we talked about how these different eras not only shaped the nature of health policy to these two social problems, but also had these implications for understanding the situation and condition of individuals. So that was really one of the foundations for me. The second was the Durkheimian theory of suicide. This, as many people know, was actually the foundation for the discipline of sociology. And what Durkheim said was that there are two axes of variation that describe every group, right? They have a certain amount of integration, which is love, care, and concern. And they have a certain amount of regulation, which is people who guide you and mentor you and tell you when you're doing something stupid, right? And together, those two things are important. And when they get out of whack, and they're too high or too low, those are when you have these unique kinds of suicidal behavior that can happen. Well, again, very powerful work, but we thought that maybe one way to think about this was to translate it from this idea of too much, too little into the idea of an actual social safety net. And when we drew out his theory in terms of a graphic, we did see what looked pretty much like a social safety net or a circus net, in which you could see those poles, each of those poles as being very dangerous for individuals. In the case of anomie, which means normlessness, or egoism, which is our classic loneliness, what happens is that the ropes of the safety net are so far apart that when individuals face a crisis, they fall through the net because the ropes aren't there to hang on to. The best place to be is in the middle or bottom of the social safety net, where there's a moderate amount of integration and regulation, and that gives you the give that allows you to bounce when you have some kind of social crisis. The other two are the ones that people don't think about enough, but I think they're absolutely relevant for understanding suicide today. One, which is fatalistic, and the idea of that is that norms become so tight in an area that the social safety net becomes a wall, and when people hit it, it shatters rather than saves them. And I can't think of a better way to think about suicides in cults or suicide clusters in high schools. I think that this is absolutely essential. And some of my colleagues' work, Anna Muller and her co-author, Seth, use this to sort of, or think in this way. And I think too often we don't think about the negative aspects, especially if we take a social support perspective, because there's a difference between not having any social support and having support which is toxic, right? And then finally, altruistic suicide, which people always talk about, schizophrenics and saints, right? That famous anthropology book. But in fact, we can talk about suicide bombers very much in this light in terms of thinking about these. So the contribution, I think, of what we were trying to do early was to really think about the things that we already knew and set a theoretical foundation for understanding how a network translation can update and make more relevant the study of social networks and social relations. So the kinds of work that I did in the beginning really were premised on the idea of what that doing social networks, as Carter Butt says, is a theoretical act, right? If you take a social network perspective, you have to rethink all of the things that I think social network people bring to the table and think about a lot. One is the meaning. What is the meaning of a social tie, and what kinds of social ties should you be asking about? There is some places, or there are some problems, or some scientists who think that all kinds of ties are social ties. But physicist Mark Newman, I think, really wrote this beautiful paper about how social networks, people's networks, are fundamentally different from technological networks, because they have this non-trivial clustering, and there are these positive correlations between these adjacent columns or vertices. I think we also need to think about it in terms of measurement. And so when you take a network perspective, you have to think about not just asking, who do you talk to, but you have to think about specificity. And one thing that we found is that when you ask people about their health, what is predictive of how they are doing are not important matters, which is sort of the general name generator that we tend to use, but asking them specifically about health networks. In other words, there has to be some sort of tailoring to the kinds of things that we think about and measure when we take this perspective. We also have to think about missing data, because this is a real problem, because none of us get 100% response rates, right? And so we have to think about this. And one of the things that we did was we were concerned about this in the Indianapolis Network Mental Health Study. And what we did is we went out one step. We asked people about their networks, but then we went out one step and we asked the networks that they mentioned, like, how do you see your relationship with this person? And here's what was interesting. The idea would be, or the better situation would be, that the people who were different between egos, report of their social network and Alter's report of the social network would be that the differences were at the outliers, right? No, the difference was right in the center of the network, where people with serious and persistent mental illness often mentioned the same person as a support and as a hassler, we called them, as looking at those negative ties, or they didn't include the hassler at all. But if you asked about them, often the person that they felt was most problematic in their life was somebody that was essentially, if you didn't think about it, missing data in your analysis. And finally, thinking about mechanisms of change. And this is where I think social networks does have a little bit of an edge over social support research in the following way. One of the things that we've seen, a phenomenon that we've seen in social networks, is the issue of churn, right? So if you ask somebody at point A, how many people, who's in your network, right? Standard social support question, standard social network question. They give you a number. You go back and ask them 2 years later, 2 months later, who's in your network? You know what? People tend to say about the same number. But guess what? What's really important is what the composition, how the composition of those networks have changed. And if you only ask about social support, you're not going to see that. I think more importantly, social support is a perceived measure, right? So how good is your social support? And it's very powerful. And I am not an anti-social support person. I believe in the power of social support as the meat on the bones of social networks, okay? But if you want to change, it's very hard to change someone's perceptions of their social network unless you change the structure of their social network. And I think that's where social network give us a little bit of a leg up. And thinking about this, the data on the right-hand side is data from the Indianapolis Network Mental Health Study, where we thought very heavily about some of these differences when you conceptualize using a network framework and any other framework. So we not only asked people in our study with serious and persistent mental illness about their networks over time, and you can see they all took a dive to a certain extent, because one of the things we see is at the beginning of an issue, people crowd around and try to help. But there's very quick burnout over time, and what tends to be left is the family. And we wanted to make sure that wasn't just a result of the disorder or something about how we measured it. So what we did at the same time is we did a representative sample of people in Indianapolis, and we asked them, we screened them out for mental health problems. And we found that in Indianapolis, networks were actually getting larger, but people with serious mental illness, persistent mental illness was decreasing. So that led me to think about the issue of utilization, which I was always interested in the problem of how do people respond to the onset of crisis? That's what I'm really interested in. And what more important crisis can you take on than life and death? But I wasn't the first person to think about this, right? Elliot Friedson, in his classic work on this, talked about the two dimensions of social networks that matter. Whether what's basically size, which is, do you have an extended network? Do you have a little tiny network? And then he talked about cultural content, I think, which was a really important addition to traditional social network theory, because he said it matters whether your networks are congruent or not congruent with medical thinking, right? With modern medical thinking. Because think about it this way. The network tells you how much of a push there is, how much influence is there on your decision making. But the cultural content tells you whether or not it pushes you to or away from mental health treatment. And Charles Kadushin, in his classic study called The Friends and Supporters of Psychotherapy, made the argument in New York City that if you had lots of friends that were in psychotherapy, then you like psychotherapy. But I also did with a group of people at the University of Puerto Rico, particularly Margarita Alegría, we did a study in Puerto Rico. And what we found was the more networks you had in Puerto Rico, the less likely you were to go to the system, for lots of reasons that we could talk about, including some of the things that some of our young scholars talked about, but also about the nature of the mental health system in Puerto Rico. So I tried to deal with this in thinking about the really good theories that were out there. You know them all, right? The health belief model, the theory of reasoned action, yeah, I think that's, did I say, I missed one, maybe socio-behavioral model. But anyway, thinking about those theories, which I cut my teeth on and really, really liked, but I kept thinking to myself, the image in those models is really of somebody weighing the costs and benefits of treatment, right? And I thought to myself, I don't know anybody who makes their decisions that way, right? And so the network episode model was an attempt to build on what we understood about social networks and social support in a dynamic fashion to argue that really the search for care is peopled, that people bounce off of one another. And I think we've learned some really interesting things about that using this approach. And I wanted to say that I think that some people have taken it and run with it in very important ways. Jane Costello and Adrian Angold have developed a children's version of this, which I think is very powerful. Arlene Stiffman at Washington University St. Louis developed the gateway provider model to talk about how different social systems become the networked gateway for kids to get care. The other thing that I am really proud about this model is that the people who tend to use it are people who are in the trenches with people with serious and persistent mental illness, and also the people who are studying diverse communities. And I think, for example, of Michael Lindsay's work on Black boys and getting into mental health services, and his newer work on suicide among African-American males. And they are people who have found this useful. And that makes me extremely happy that maybe there's been a contribution there. The other thing, though, was taking what we knew about Durkheim's suicide and sort of thinking about how it was being used. And Durkheim did not talk about networks per se. He talked about social groups. He talked about rich versus poor. He talked about Catholics versus Protestants. And at one point, suicidologists said that if there's one law of suicide, it's that Catholics commit suicide more than Protestants. And it was like, really? Do they? Like, do we know that? Because mostly we're studying suicide rates, which says something very different. It says people who live in areas with lots of Catholics have lower suicide rates than people who live in areas with lots of Protestants. So we started to try to think about what was the nature of the religious networks of people that live in areas with different suicide rates. And we were able to start to think about harmonizing data in a way that we could look to the General Social Survey that had network data, and it had really detailed data on religion. And we were able to find that, yes, in the United States, which is the most denominationalized religious country in the world, right? We have more religious denominations than anybody. That in fact, Catholicism does continue to anchor the bottom of suicide rates. And guess what? They are also the people who are most likely to have only other Catholics in their social networks. And as you get away from that, you go up the sides of the net, where you get on one side Jonestown and on the other side atheists, right? Where the suicide rates, where you get the sort of networks, just disappearing, and the other ones where they close up. So I think the early stuff that we did to try to translate, I think we learned some things that I think are interesting, but it struck me that that wasn't far enough, that we really needed to go further in terms of the next steps, because we're seeing, as the administrative scientists in the 70s talked about, that more and more problems are wicked, right? Or if you're from Rhode Island like I am, wicked. So got these wicked problems, and they're not amenable to linear thinking. And they're a little bit like whack-a-mole, like if you hit it somewhere, it'll pop up somewhere else. So that we needed to start thinking in terms of larger embedded systems. Now, there is no shortage of ecological models, multi-layer models. This is one. I couldn't actually then find this again in Google. But you can think about Brothenbrenner's early theory of child development, right? That was probably the granddaddy of them all. But the problem with those models, and I've seen ones I like this one because I thought it was particularly pretty. But the problem with these models is that they've only really satisfied one of 5 conditions I think that you need to meet to do a multi-level model that's going to give you some purchase. And that is, I think we've got it down. We have a pretty good idea what the set of contextual levels are that matter, right? And this has been documented in empirical research, and there were a lot of really excellent reports that came out of the national academies, came out of the NIH, that talked about like neurons to neighborhoods, right? Just a brilliant, that's one of my go-to books. But the problem is with these is that they don't offer an underlying mechanism or agent of action that connects these. And more importantly, if you ask the scientists at each one of those levels to come up with the variables that matter, they'll give you at minimum 30 variables that matter, right? So all of a sudden we've got this huge amount of variables. We don't know how they're interconnected. But if you take a network perspective, it gives you a way to sort of narrow down. You have to argue and think about how does that variable, how is it affected by the levels above and below it? How does it interact with those? And the other thing of taking a network perspective that I find very useful is that it employs a metaphor and an analytic language that now is very familiar, especially since network science came in the 1990s, right? I mean, now when you've got the physicists on board, you've got some really powerful partners there, right, to think about these things. So everybody from biologists to physicists to sociologists, anthropologists, people are thinking about social networks. And so that gives us a way to talk to one another. And I think it also suggests that we're not always going to be able to have network data that matches what, the real experts want. And so we're going to have to use the full range of methodological tools that have been proven useful. And I think, as I mentioned with the example with social support, is I think it provides a tangible way to intervene from everything from epidemiology to understanding treatment, activism, and policy. So what did we do next? Well, what we did is we brought together a whole bunch of scientists, right? And so if you look at that list, which I can't really see from here, it includes neuroscientists and physicists and psychologists and methodologists and geneticists and just all the people that were interested in sort of thinking about this. And for me, this brought my two areas of research together because I started thinking about the network, the safety net, as a theoretical plane that exists, right, at every level, that there's always some kind of combination of what you're looking at that provides that nadir of support, that bounce at the bottom, and that they can all sort of go in wonky fashion to dangerous poles. And so this really fits very well with people like Eleanor Ostrom's ideas in terms of the commons and complexity theory. And it really deploys interaction and dynamics, I think, in a way. And so the fractal structure, which is that self-repeating kind of thing, getting all these people together was to ask them the following question. In your own area of research, is there network research or is there research that supports the idea of networks in operation at your level? And as a result of that, in the first paper that we did is that we looked at this using alcohol abuse or alcohol dependence as the area to which we tried to see if there were there was a way to sort of think about this. And it looked like it has some interesting possibilities because it combines the idea of biological embedding, which we think is really important. Clyde Hertzman, the anthropologist, coming up with the idea that biological embedding really helps us explain why things like discrimination, why and how discrimination gets under the skin, right? But then we also have the classic Mark Granovetter social embedding, in which we look at the opposite. So we were really trying to use this it's a theoretical model. Can we ever operationalize this? I don't know. But it's a way to think, and we've been able to use it to take our research a little further. Okay. So the things that I wanted to talk about there are three things I wanted to talk about in terms of our current research. And one is thinking about pathways to care. Even when I looked at Freitzen was predicting who would go to a doctor versus not go to a doctor. that doesn't answer, I think, the question that John Clausen, who was in the socio-environmental lab at NIMH in the 50s and 60s, right? And his question was, why is it that people with serious mental illness do not get into treatment quickly and efficiently, right? And so one of the things that we've been able to do, and this goes back to Jeremy's use of latent class analysis, one of my favorite analytic tools, is that what we have seen consistently is that individuals with the most serious problems have the most complicated pathways to care. Why is that? If it's so serious and so obvious, why aren't they just going to the emergency room? Well, there's a lot of reasons, but one of the things is that we found that there are some basic pathways we need to think about that, like Durkheim, say there are different phenomenon. So one way you get into care is you make a choice. And that's sort of the standard thing that people think about, that the theory of reasoned action and the health belief model did, right? But there are also two other pathways that are important. One is coercion. And we found in our study that 25% of people who ended up in the mental health system came in resisting. They came in either under what we call formal hard coercion, which is the law brought them in, or soft coercion, which is mom guilt, right? That got you into treatment. And then the most interesting thing we found was that 30% of people got into mental health treatment by a pathway we called muddling through. They couldn't tell us exactly how they got there, right? And this concept we borrowed from Charles Lindblom, the political scientist, who said that this is the way Americans make social policy, which seems kind of right to us, right? But some of the work that we're working on now, or things that we're working on now, is trying to understand how the structures, the cultural structures, which is represented here on the bottom right, where how does the person think about their mental health? How does their social network think about mental health? And then how does the state-of-the-art measure used in the population, right? So Rob Gibbons's, ability to do adaptive testing in the population. How much do those overlap in terms of thinking about this? And how does that cultural structure map onto Jeremy's latent class structure of the different kinds of pathways or combinations that people use? And one of the things that we found is that, in fact, we're starting to see that it looks very different for mental illness as opposed to physical illness, which I don't think we necessarily anticipated. The second area of research that I think that this is applicable to is Goffman's classic area of stigma, which I became involved in because I was asking myself, after we started doing the network work, what is in those social networks? And as a classically trained sociologist, the obvious answer, again, from the socio-environmental lab at NIMH, was stigma, right? And one of the things that contemporary stigma research has found is that the most consistent correlate of high levels of stigma is not having contact with people with mental health problems, right? But the measure is like a machete. It's very, very crude. It's like, have you or anyone you know had mental illness, right? And the idea was that had all kinds of implications for policy and anti-stigma efforts. But as, again, thinking from a network perspective, that just didn't really set right with us. So in the 2018 National Stigma Study, which was the third wave of that study, we put on a network battery and asked, tell us about the people you know with mental illness. And what we found there in terms of this is that what really seems to be happening is that it's actually very bad if you know a lot of people, but not very well. Right? And that actually increases the amount of stigma you feel towards people with mental illness. Whereas if you have strong ties to them, then that lets you see their full humanity, right? And that's how we sort of explain that. But I think one of the things I'm most excited about is how this has allowed us to break through data barriers in the study of suicide. And that is that, as I mentioned, that most sociologists, when we study suicide, we measure suicide rates. But again, if we go back to the Catholic versus Protestant question, right? If we go back to the question of, how does religion factor in with suicide? The question we want to know is, in those areas where suicide is low, is it that the Catholics are having those kinds of networks and being protected? Or is it that the Protestants are just trying to avoid any contact with the Catholics? Like, what is going on at different levels of aggregation? Well, this presents a really big analytic problem because you can't get data at that level on both individuals and context. I mean, you can, if you think about the classic Jackson heart study, you can do that if you're asking somebody about heart disease. You can't do that with suicide because the people you want to talk to are dead, right? Now, innovation, the NVDRS. Thank you very much, CDC, right? The National Violent Death Reporting System. They have data on individuals. It's a follow-back study in the classic Ed Schneidman way, right? Father of suicidology in America, where they go back and they ask people, okay, it's not great data, but it's data. But still, what's the missing piece, right? The missing piece is you have data on people who died. Who's the appropriate comparison group? Everybody who's still alive. Where do you get that data, right? Well, you get it from the U.S. Census. So we've combined, because the U.S. Census dropped the long form and went to the American Community Survey, we were able to break through data barriers in the study of suicide and ask the question, it's not network data, right? But if we think about the concept of homophily, we can make a theoretical argument about if networks matter, then it should be the case that people who live in areas like them should have greater support and interpret different kinds of crises in the same way or in different ways, right? So let me give you an example, because it took us a while to think through this. But let's take the case of unemployment, right, which is the graph on the left, okay? Unemployment, one of the most consistent predictors of suicide. Individual level, aggregate level, doesn't matter, okay? But what the chart on the far left, but the first one shows where we show what kinds of levels we're looking at. What that shows is if you live in an area, if you're unemployed and you live in an area where lots of other people are unemployed, the effect of unemployment on suicide is minimal. The problem is if you're unemployed and you live in an area where everybody else is employed. And the way that we understand that is through the idea of homophily, like birds of a feather flock together, and you interpret failure or crisis differently, right? If you live in Detroit and you're unemployed, that is not going to raise your suicide risk. But if you live in Westport, Connecticut, and you're the only one that's unemployed around the big McMansions, you're going to blame yourself as opposed to being in Detroit where you blame the system. And that's what we think is the underlying mechanism of this. But to take that one step further, what we did is we asked about what was the effect of the Great Recession, right? Because you would expect that changed that calculus in people's minds. And what that graph on the far left shows that there was an effect of sameness, right? Which technically has this term cross-level socio-demographic homogeneity. Okay, excuse me, I am a sociologist. We do use some jargon, but we call it sameness, right? So what sameness exists before the Great Recession. But during the Great Recession, the power of sameness almost went away, right? Because everybody was unemployed, right? But look at what happens in the blue line. What happens when the economy started to return? Those people who did not get rehired had the higher levels of suicide, right? And so the sameness effect actually became more powerful after the recession because the economy was coming back, but you were not, right? So we're continuing to pursue this, trying to figure out other ways where we can use network theory, but be satisfied with not having network data per se of the type that most aficionados and the really sophisticated people in social networks want. But I'm happy to sort of live with this kind of data because I think the theory is powerful enough to give us ways to think about this. So now how does this work in terms of thinking about the real world? Okay, I'm a basic scientist. It's not that I don't have any interest in the real world. It's just not why I got into this, what I thought I was doing. But be careful what happens. I got asked by two groups, Indiana University and Bring Change to Mind, which is an advocacy group that you may know was started by actor Glenn Close, to take on the issues of mental health, suicide, and stigma on college campuses. And I thought, oh my, where am I going with this? So what we did was we thought about and went through the network literature and said, what principles are there in networks? And there's really good data on, there are good studies on change. And we came up with 5 major principles that we thought were congruent with a network perspective. And over a 4-year period, we followed the entering students in the 2016 cohort. And we were able to mark using these 5 principles. And, you know, I can talk about them, any of them later, but they're all based on network research. For example, Steve Vasey in his theory shows that there are periods in people's development when they're more open to change in their attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors. And that's when their networks change. And when people come to college, it sets up all the conditions for network change. So if you want to change their attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors, get them in orientation, right? And start and be consistent. Okay, so just give you an example of how that worked. And so what we did was we started to build, using a network perspective, the kinds of networks going from Hank Green and his work on game changers with the people at University of Nevada, the idea of game changers. This comes from a classic network research on the importance of opinion leaders, right? So who are the opinion leaders at Indiana University who were important to get on board to be able to do this intervention? And we got them on board. And then the intervention network, leverage, that's why the principle of leverage was important, was create a network not only of the game changers, but of all the parts of Indiana University that could have a consistent message about stigma. Where we are now, and as I said, we've been able to show both change in attitudes and behaviors in college students over time on this. And this is actually a free program. And we're trying to figure out, how do you build a national network for a program that is free, but does require certain things like high touch in order to sort of try to temper down the rising suicide rate among American youth. We're not anywhere near it yet, but those are the sort of networks that we're building, that we have contacts with, and we'll see how it goes. So what this said to me is that I think that we need to think about, and this could be blasphemy, and I hope nobody has any stones to throw at this point, but I think we really need to think about the translational pathway in terms of how we do social change. I think in terms of the gold standard, the randomized clinical trial, I have problems with that. I have problems with it in part because it's an individual-based model, right, as opposed to a network-based model. So, of course, I'm not going to like it as much. But I think that we can deal with that. Instead of fidelity to the model, I think fidelity to the principles of change, I think, is doable. And so we're now talking about precision medicine, right, tailoring to the genetic profile. Why can't we think about precision translation, which is tailoring to the social context? In other words, instead of having canned materials that people have to use exactly the way that everybody else used them, why can't we have an on-site immersion where people have a basket of options that have all been evidence-based that they can use and moderate to their culture, to their social context, to their age, to all of those things that are important to them? I think this is one of the reasons that many randomized clinical trials, after they've been shown to be successful, don't get adopted. People don't feel they have ownership. And I think that we can do that. So I like online materials, but I think online materials have to be combined with community engagement and additive partnerships in the site. So why can't we move from precision? If we're going to do precision medicine, can we also do precision translation? And I think that this becomes particularly important when we're trying to unravel the social determinants of health, particularly among minoritized populations. And I draw here from a sociologist named Charles Tilley, who was a network person, and he talks about durable inequality. Why is it so hard to break the bonds of inequality? And he came up with a meso level of inequality. And the way that I interpret his work is that, like stigma, suicide, and pathways to care, inequality is played out through social interactions, positive or negative. Again, Goffman said you cannot experience stigma except through social interactions. And so to me, that this is a positive, like this is a way to think about this. I think we have a long way to go, but I think a network perspective underneath and through the social determinants of health might give us new ways to think about how we can change things. And I'm really excited about the way that, I don't want biomedical scientists in science are now acknowledging that facing the coming challenges in health, illness, and healing is going to require a coupling of systematic social change and scientific progress. And that's where I'm hoping that we head. And thank you for your attention.
You have questions?
Thank you so much, Dr. Pasqualito. If anyone in the room has questions, we would welcome them now. And Lauren's going to keep an eye out on the online. If you have questions online, please hit the send live feedback icon and type away. Jane?
Okay, thank you very much. That was, wow, a tour de force, an overview of many decades of research in that area. And I just had a question about methodology. And you said you're a basic researcher, but how do you propose we measure networks? And how is that changing in this digital environment?
I think it's different. I mean, I think you have to figure out if you're doing online, I think the physicists have got this knocked. They really know how to scrape the web and get the ties, and they've come up with, ideas about the rich club, which is a certain particular structure that I think network scientists call something else. People who do social networks call something else. For us, we were asked to be part of the Phoenix Toolkit. And so if you go there, you will see that I chaired the social psychology Phoenix Toolkit group, but Barbara Entwistle at Chapel Hill did the structural one or the demographic one. And she asked us to include sort of a standard battery of how you do this. And this is where we get into trouble with, trying to be part of research because, people will call me and say, I want to put networks in my study. And I'm like, okay, it's a 20-minute battery. And people say things to me like, well, I really wanted 2 questions. Right? And I'm like, you can't really do it with 2 questions. I mean, you can do something. You can ask people about the size of their networks or something. And I think, as I said, social support has very, people's perceptions of their social support, very powerful impacts on people's health. So if they just want to go there, they can't do networks, but they can do something that's relational. So I think there's pretty standard methodologies. The big distinction we make is, again, some jargon, the difference between egocentric networks or personal networks, right? Networks that are connected to a person. So I tell you who my people are, right? Versus sociocentric or complete or full networks where you have to get the networks from everybody in that sort of sphere. And that's very hard to do. But I think there are really good books out there about how to do this. So I think it's pretty standard. I think the methodology is pretty standard on this. But what I would say is don't be afraid to tailor it to your question. Because when we took the chance of not just asking important matters, which was the name generator that everybody was using, and we added health measures, health networks, we really thought it was going to be the intersection of health networks and important matters networks that was going to be powerful. It wasn't. It was simply health networks. So you take a guess, you take a gamble, collect the data.
Software programs have.
Yeah. And, you know, people love these. I mean, if you have the time, especially the ones that are online where, you know, you put people in concentric circles and then you connect them or not. People really like doing those. I think the problem is that we as scientists are like, do we really want to spend a half an hour doing this? If that's not really what we want to do, the answer for me is yes. I think the answer for a lot of other people is not, is no. So. Go ahead.
Thank you so much for your talk and congratulations on the award. Very well deserved. I just wanted to ask about like a social network intervention.
Yeah.
So we might be able to do that at different levels. Like we might be able to do that for a person, and then we might be able to also do that, you know, as you're working in the universities, like at an organizational level or in a community, right? And can you talk about what those different kinds of interventions might look like?
Yeah, so I'll tell you about one that one of the reasons I got into doing this was NIH funded projects and Robert Wood Johnson project called the 9 City Study. And what they did, this was, I think, led in part by Joe Morrissey at Chapel Hill. And what they did was they created a central health navigator. This was at the organizational level. And what they were able to show is that with this health navigator who connected all of the other providers in the area, that they were able to actually get a more integrated, better healthcare system, right? So we've kind of done it. But why was that study not 100% success? Because they had somebody else study what happened to people in those 9 cities over time that had serious and persistent mental illness. Okay. And they showed no connection between the two, right? But so the system got better, but people didn't get better. But those 2 studies were conducted independently. They didn't connect people's experiences into that system. They didn't draw the ties between the levels. So we don't know whether there was a subset of people who became more integrated into the system and got better because they didn't measure that. But it was a masterpiece for its time. So we kind of know how to do this. It's unusual and time consuming, and it's kind of different, you know. It's a way of thinking about it that I think we can do those things. Yeah. I mean, it was great to do it on a college campus and watch, like one of the findings when I say behavior changed, right? So the behavior was, we would have liked it to have been something like, change in the use of the college counseling services, right? We couldn't get that for kind of obvious HIPAA reasons. But what we were able to do, what we found is over time, more students were reporting people with mental health problems in their network, right? So what do we think happened? That people, as they were doing this big thing, campus, it was all about bring change to mind. We did all kinds of events, all led by students, right? Students came up with them, students led them. We just helped provide them with the things that they needed. Did they run out and say, oh God, we're doing this big campaign, so we got to get somebody with mental illness, got to be my friend? No, it was a disclosure. It was a change in the disclosure behavior. So more people understood that there were people they were already friends with who had mental health problems, and now they were free to talk about it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Are there any online questions? Lauren, I'm going to check. No? Okay. Roz, go ahead.
Thank you so much. It's just a fabulous talk. I'm wondering, things not change over time. Families used to be within the family much more similar. And now we have such diversity. Families have people of multiple race, ethnicity, of nativity, and also now we have transnational families. How do we think about social networks in this increasing and multiplying complexity?
So we just did an analysis. We've done a study called the Person-to-Person Health Interview Study. And it's a 3,000 person scientifically selected representative sample of the state of Indiana. It's kind of an omnibus health survey. And we asked them about suicidal ideation. And we found that there are different kinds of networks that can result in lower levels of suicidal ideation. And one of them is the solid family network, which you kind of expect. But the other one is what somebody talked about earlier, basically the fictive kin network, where people create their own networks of the people around them that matter to them because maybe their family doesn't work. So it could be mixed, some family, but some friends. The two networks that were really toxic was the empty network, which you expect, right, from Durkheim. That's where the ropes are far apart. People don't have anybody. But the other one was something that we've also found in a study we're doing with Spiro Agnew and Tassie Parker in Arizona, or New Mexico, among Native Americans. And that is the large and loose network of people who also have mental health problems. And their suicide risk is higher. So these people who think they have a lot of people around them, they can draw on them, but these ties are not, they're not ones you can hang with these people, you can drink with these people, right? But they're not there for the kinds of support that you need to sort of tamp down your likelihood of suicide. So we've now found this in 2 studies. The large, loose network is actually very toxic.
Thank you.
Are there any final questions for Dr. Pescasoluto? Then let's join me in thanking her again for this amazing talk and congratulating her.
Very cool.
Just a couple last minutes. Let me find the right page. I want to thank our ESI presenters, Drs. Luke, Perry, Rhea Sandin, and Tulane. And congratulations again on your award. It's another round of congratulations. And a big thank you and congratulations to Dr. Bernice Pescasoluto, our 17th NIH Matilda White Riley Distinguished Lecturer. Fabulous to hear from you. Thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it. And finally, please mark your calendars. June 6th, 7th, and 11th will be the Future of Scientific Conferencing virtual meeting to bring together diverse perspectives from multiple disciplines to explore the advantages, barriers, gaps, and opportunities in the future of scientific conferencing for the behavioral and social sciences. You can find more information about this exciting conference on our website. I also encourage you to subscribe to OBSSR's newsletter to receive events and news updates at obssr.od.nih.gov. And at this time, I will conclude the 17th NIH Matilda White Riley Behavioral and Social Science Honors. Thank you so much.